Have you ever felt the weight of another man's boot on your dignity? Imagine living in a land promised to be yours, yet every sunrise brings new orders barked by those who see you as less than human. A land where your sweat feeds the wealth of arrogant nobles, and your silence is the only thing they respect. But silence is breaking. Poor farmers, widows, young patriots with calloused hands and empty pockets, mocked, taxed, and beaten by red-coated masters who sneer at the very word freedom. They take what they want. They call it law, they call it empire. But deep within the hearts of those oppressed, a flame refuses to die. Have you ever felt powerless? Stay with me. Betrayal cuts deeper than any blade. Neighbors branded as traitors, children forced to bow before the king's colors, soldiers dragged from their homes at midnight. And yet, they endure. Every humiliation becomes another reason to rise, another reason to fight, another reason to sacrifice everything for the right to stand tall as a patriot. What you are about to hear may shock you, because in the struggle for freedom, ordinary souls become legends, forged not by glory, but by suffering. And on one brutal night, a choice would change everything.
Welcome, my fellow patriots. From which city are you watching today? Check if you're already subscribed. Give this video a like. And now, let's begin our story.
Eleanor's hands trembled as she lifted the bar from the door, yet her resolve did not waver. When the storm slammed the shutters, she barely noticed. What mattered were the men at her threshold, patriots scarred by cold and war, and the youth burning with fever, who might never see another dawn. As they stepped inside, mud spread across her floor like a map of their long struggle. Martha Lyle, a midwife hardened by too many nights beside death, knelt at once beside the boy. Vinegar cloths, willow bark tea, quiet words meant to keep a frightened soul anchored to life. These rebels did not plead for safety or salvation. They asked only for a hearth to thaw stiff fingers and hearts pushed to the edge of despair. Eleanor gave them her fire, her broth, the last dry blanket her husband had carried into his own final battle for liberty. A widow with little left, yet everything she owned held a breath of defiance. In that small cabin, where hail still cracked against the timber like musket fire, she chose rebellion over fear. To show kindness, even under tyranny, was an act of pure resistance. Caleb Finch, ever watchful, paused mid-step. His face darkened, a distant crack of hooves, the kind that did not belong to neighbors, but to predators in polished boots. The British Light Dragoons, hunters of patriots, wolves draped in king's colors. Eleanor saw Alden Crow's jaw stiffen, the scar across his cheek pulling tight like a stitched-in warning. These men carried secrets. They carried a hidden truth heavy enough to draw death straight to her door. Alden met her stare. No words passed, yet she understood. Betrayal lurked in the hills, and someone had delivered these men into the jaws of the empire. For years, she had endured insult after insult, taxes that starved families, soldiers who spat at graves, orders barked as though her age robbed her of dignity. Each disgrace left another mark on the heart. Tonight, those scars demanded a decision. Thomas Reed gasped, struggling for breath, and Eleanor gripped his hand, seeing in his fevered eyes every son forced to kneel before a tyrant's whip. She had buried one husband under this soil. She would not bury freedom next to him. Outside, the hooves drew closer. Bridles rattled. Authority approached, soaked in arrogance and iron. The English believed they owned this land, these souls, this night. They believed fear could crush the patriot spirit. But they had never met Eleanor Pike. Mercy, once freely offered, now hardened into defiance. The widow reached for the fowling piece leaning against the wall, the last memory of a man who died fighting for independence. The barrel was cold. Her blood was fire. In that moment, she made her vow. If the empire demanded submission, it would find resistance instead. The hailstorm raged. The cabin breathed tension, every heartbeat counted down to the inevitable clash. Decisions sharpened like blades. Lives balanced between sacrifice and deliverance. No turning back. The knock of tyranny was coming. Eleanor faced the riders before fear could speak for her. Captain Henry Blackwell sat tallest among them, draped in a polished uniform that glimmered with stolen authority. Hailstones slid down his cloak like beads of cold silver, but his twisted grin was colder still. His pale skin caught the lantern light in a ghostly hue, and beneath his eyes dark circles marked a man who enjoyed the hunt more than the victory. Loyalists surrounded him, neighbors who had traded their honor for English coin. Silas Pennington, once a simple merchant, now a crowned parasite, smirked as if betrayal were a badge of nobility. Blackwell studied Eleanor's humble home with a cruelty sharpened by privilege. "Step aside, old rebel," he ordered, venom dripping from every syllable. "Those rustics behind your door are fugitives, vermin. Let the king's justice cleanse this ground." His words were meant to degrade, to cut deeper than any bayonet, to insult every patriot who ever dared to dream of independence. Eleanor did not budge. "These men are under my roof. My fire warms them. They are my guests." The captain's smile twisted into something monstrous. The laugh that slipped through his teeth was perverse, delighted by the promise of power. "Not for long," he murmured, voice smooth as poison. Before blades, humiliation always came first. Blackwell turned to the scouts, dripping rain and pride inside the doorway. "Look at you," he mocked, "pretending to be soldiers, your farmers, beggars, insects crushed beneath the Empire's heel." He spat the final word, "Patriots," as if the very idea of rebellion were a foul stench. Alden Crow stood silent, eyes locked on the captain. His scar seemed to burn brighter, a mark of every atrocity these oppressors had inflicted. The scouts held their ground despite aching bones and empty stomachs. Each man carried a past full of broken promises. Each still believed in the right to walk unshackled. Blackwell dismounted. Boots hit the mud with a splash that sounded like a verdict. He took a step toward Eleanor. "Do you know what happens," he asked softly, "when peasants defy their betters?" His glove lifted her chin with the back of his knuckles, an intimate act twisted into dominance. The degradation was deliberate. The disgrace meant to teach obedience. But Eleanor felt transformation instead, rage shaping itself into courage. Inside the cabin, Martha shielded Thomas Reed from the scene, whispering strength into his fevered dreams. Caleb's hand hovered near his knife. Even the fire seemed to crackle with anticipation, sparks rising like tiny rebellions. Blackwell's voice grew louder. "The law of the crown will be respected. Tonight, dignity dies under English boots." He expected surrender. He expected tears. He would find something else entirely. The storm howled across the fields. The Empire pressed closer. The line between mercy and defiance thinned to a breath. Eleanor's jaw tightened as Pennington slithered forward, his merchant's smile curdled by greed. He had once bartered grain and nails with her husband, laughed beside their hearth like a friend. Now he stood beneath the king's banner, claiming superiority as if betrayal granted him nobility. What twisted pride could make a man spit on his own neighbors? What coin could purchase his dignity? Inside a flour tin near the hearth, Eleanor hid a folded parchment, her land deed, earned through sweat and sacrifice. Her husband ploughed this ground, buried kin beneath it, raised walls with his own hands. But Pennington's forged claim, whispered in British courts and taverns thick with liquor and lies, threatened to erase that legacy. The crown loved paperwork more than people. Stolen signature could destroy a life quicker than gunpowder. The door burst open behind Eleanor as Reverend Silas Booker stumbled in, face whipped raw by rain, breath shaking with urgency. He spoke of the Kingfisher Tavern, where Pennington had bragged of tonight's plan. Blackwell would seize the Pike homestead first, call it lawful confiscation, then drag her rebel guests to a noose. In that smoky room, loyalist tongues dripped contempt. They mocked the poor militiamen fighting for independence. They laughed at the idea of farmers daring to claim equality with officers of the crown. But one voice did not yield. Nathan Pike, Eleanor's nephew, blood of her blood, seated alone among wolves. When a young loyalist jeered, calling patriots ragged animals who worship liberty they'll never taste, Nathan slammed his tankard so hard, ale leapt into the fire. He stood, eyes blazing hotter than the tavern flames. "Not on our soil," he vowed. Every head turned. Silence cut through the room like a blade. A promise had been born. Now Booker's warning arrived just seconds before the boots outside drew tighter. Words had traveled faster than horses. But would they save anyone inside this fragile cabin? Eleanor thought of the parchment. With it, she could expose Pennington's fraud. Without it, everything would be stripped. Property, pride, name, leaving her nothing but chains and shame. Blackwell leaned close enough for her to smell his arrogance. "You peasants cling to scraps," he taunted. "Scraps of land, scraps of courage, scraps of hope." His hand reached past her, toward the flour tin, toward the heart of her life. She slapped it away. Gasps erupted. The storm swallowed the sound, but not its meaning. Alden's fingers curled around his musket grip. Caleb shifted weight to the balls of his feet. Martha steadied the boy, praying strength into his trembling bones. In every chest, thunder matched the storm above. A spark leapt between oppressor and oppressed. Words had lit the fuse. Weather and war would supply the powder. The hail softened. The wind held its breath. Something far more violent was coming. Dawn arrived like a wound across the sky, a pale stripe of grey that carried no comfort. The storm had dragged the night into the morning, leaving the earth soaked and shivering. Yet neighbors came, one by one, not summoned by law, but by the ancient pull of duty to one another. Isaac Boone, a hunter whose silence spoke louder than sermons. Ruth Carter, a widow, clutching the hands of two trembling boys who had already seen too much of the king's justice. Abel Garner, a blacksmith with shoulders carved by toil, knuckles scarred by the struggle to feed his children under the weight of cruel taxes. They were tired of shame, tired of kneeling. Reverend Booker climbed the rickety porch and seized the old iron bell. Each toll traveled the valley like a challenge, one peal for every soul ready to stand. The sound cracked against the hills. It echoed through barns and broken dreams. It drew forth patriots who had swallowed fear long enough. A line of muddy footprints formed, a growing testimony of rebellion. Blackwell circled them on horseback, boots polished with the arrogance of empire. His laughter slithered across the field, sharp as bayonets. "Rabble!" he called. "A parade of beggars!" His contempt aimed to reduce them to dust, to remind them of their place beneath a crown that saw them as livestock, valued only for labor, never for dignity. He gestured, and from the road the British soldiers hauled forward a small field cannon. Its iron mouth pointed directly at Eleanor's homestead, promising fire and ruin. "Submit," Blackwell declared, "or watch everything you pretend to love burn." Beside him, Pennington unrolled a parchment, thick with lies. "By authority of the crown," he began, voice dripping false pride. Eleanor stepped through the mud, poker gripped like a scepter of defiance. Her skirt was soaked, her hair whipped by the wind. She was a solitary figure against a machine of oppression, yet no tremor reached her voice. "That parchment," she said, pointing at Pennington's writ, "is nothing but disgrace." She thrust her poker upward, and in her other hand raised the true deed, her husband's legacy living in ink and sacrifice. "This," she cried, "is dignity on paper, and that," she glared at Pennington, "is betrayal dressed as law." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A soldier tore Pennington's forgery in half, and Blackwell's eyes narrowed. He wanted obedience. He wanted fear. Instead, he saw transformation. Ordinary farmers standing taller than trained cavalry, women refusing degradation, children clutching hope as if it were steel. A thin line drawn in the mud. Choose liberty or kneel. Caleb Finch planted his boots beside Eleanor. Abel Garner crossed his arms like a shield. Ruth Carter pushed her boys behind her skirt, lifting her chin with a courage the Crown would never understand. They were bruised by hardship, but unbroken. Each heartbeat spoke the same truth. Independence was worth any sacrifice. The cannon wheels creaked. A fuse dangled like a promise of death. Blackwell's smile returned, macabre, sure of victory. But the air had changed. The backcountry itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first spark. Words had torn the veil. Now steel would decide. Paper shreds fluttered to the ground. Steel remained. Rain swallowed the last shards of hail, turning fields and faces into a blur of grey. Determination. Alden Crow raised his chin. One nod, nothing more, and the world snapped from threat to war. Caleb Finch fired first, the musket's crack echoing off wet timber. A dragoon's plume exploded into feathers. Shock flickered across the British line. For a heartbeat, silence. Then Blackwell roared his order. Teeth bared like a predator denied the kill. "Advance!" Redcoats surged forward, horses churning mud into blood-clotted paths. But the Patriots melted into the landscape they knew, like scripture. Bullets sparked from briar thickets and alder shadows. The river's teeth, a narrow thorn-choked creek, became a battlefield crafted for defiance. The bright coats struggled, tangled by nature itself. Every tree harbored rebellion. Every rock whispered, "No more chains." Eleanor Pike stood square at her doorway, fouling peace braced against her shoulder. Her bones ached from years of hardship, yet she held steady as scripture carved in stone, each breath deliberate, each trigger. Squeeze a declaration that her life belonged to no king. Smoke curled from the barrel. Another shot. Another prayer that Thomas Reed's fever would break before tyranny stole his future. Inside the cabin, Martha Lyle pressed cloths to the boy's burning brow, murmuring hope into skin too young to be carved by death. Thomas whimpered, hearing the chaos outside. His struggle was its own battlefield, his enemy invisible, but just as cruel. Eleanor refused to let either enemy win. Isaac Boone struck. From a low ridge, his rifle crack slicing through rain. Ruth Carter shielded her sons behind overturned barrels, reloading with trembling fingers that refused to accept disgrace. Abel Garner wielded his hammer when his powder ran dry. Iron against polished steel. Every strike spoke life into independence. Blackwell's confident smirk faltered. These rustics did not run. They transformed. They fought like men and women who understood the worth of their own breath. Loyalists wavered, questioning whether crowns truly beat courage. Pennington shouted for order, his voice shrill with panic. The forged authority he clung to dissolved when confronted by those who knew justice by heart, not by seal. Mud splashed over his fine boots, an insult no gold could clean. The creek banks erupted again with Patriot fire, carrying humiliation back to the oppressors who had long dished it out. Rebellion grew teeth. The king's arrogance met the colonists' wrath, and neither would leave unscarred. Eleanor's third shot rang true. A dragoon toppled into the river's teeth, swallowed by currents that showed no respect for rank. In that instant, she felt her husband's spirit standing guard. Her journey from grieving widow to warrior of independence was complete. But war is a shifting beast. Alden's voice sliced through the storm. "Fall back to the ridge!" The fight bled across terrain. Fury dragged uphill where fate waited with arms folded. The ridge loomed, high ground that could either crown their defense or become their grave. Eleanor wiped rain from her eyes. Thomas groaned. Blackwell snarled, rallying his riders with promises of royal reward. The air thickened, ready to choose who would rise and who would be buried beneath trampled dreams. The earth trembled with the weight of decisions made in mud and blood. The ridge would speak next. They climbed the ridge, gasping, boots slipping in red mud, the storm chewing at their backs. Widow's pride, a rise of limestone and stubborn memories. Where Eleanor's husband once broke earth for corn, dreaming of a future ruled by fairness, not crowns. That hope had never left this ground. Even rain could not wash it away. Martha Lyle knelt beside Thomas Reed, ripping her own shawl into strips, wrapping his chest as though holding his soul in place. The boy's lashes fluttered. He tasted gunpowder on the air. "Don't let them take our flag," he whispered, voice thin but unbroken. Eleanor pressed his hand. Liberty lived in the fragile breaths of the young. Hoofbeats thrashed below. Blackwell herded his riders up the slope, sneering at the sight of farmers clinging to rocks and roots. His voice carried contempt like a blade. "Cowardly dogs, come down and kneel." He wanted their fear more than their blood. A crack of thunder. Boots crested the ridge. Nathan Pike arrived breathless, a dozen militiamen at his back. Their eyes flickered with terror and resolve, battling for control. Nathan looked to his aunt, rain cutting lines down his face, like war paint. He planted his feet beside her, shoulders squared against the storm. "If we fight," he said, "we defend. We don't deliver ourselves into their chains." It was a moment of decision. No turning back. Some of the neighbors trembled, clutching rusted muskets, tools, kitchen knives, anything sharp enough to slice through humiliation. But none walked away. Rebellion had taken root. Sacrifice would water it. Blackwell raised his saber, eager to end this insult to empire. Take their weapons, then take their pride. The dragoons pushed the cannon forward, iron wheels grinding the earth that once fed Patriot children. Its dark mouth stared at Eleanor's home like a hungry beast. British soldiers lit the fuse rope, its ember glowing like the eye of tyranny. Rain hissed against the spark, but fire clung on, persistent as oppression. Eleanor's breath stilled. That cannon meant more than destruction. It meant a message. Dignity would be erased, land devoured, identity crushed. Beneath the Crown's decree, if the shot fired, shame would take root where independence once dared to grow. Alden crouched low, eyes narrowed. Caleb wiped mud from his sightline. Abel Garner gripped his hammer as if it were divine wrath. Each heartbeat was a drum toward transformation. The ridge felt alive, resisting the boots that tried to claim it. If they fire, Eleanor thought, something precious will break. Perhaps the cabin, perhaps her bones, perhaps the thin thread that held the boys. Life to this world, but not the cause. Never the cause. Above them, lightning scarred the sky, white fire against grey. The fuse sputtered, clinging to life. The world shrank to that tiny burning thread, the distance between survival and annihilation narrowing into a breath. Wind tore at their flags. Hearts pounded. The cannon crept toward its roar. Right, the flame of freedom lives in me. The cannon's roar cracked the ridge like the sky itself had cursed them. Limestone shattered, spraying. Jagged shards through smoke and rain. Abel Garner staggered, blood blooming through his shirt like a dark flower. He met the earth with a grunt, half curse, half prayer, his great hands still clenched, as if he could choke death before it claimed him. Eleanor's heart lurched, but she did not falter. The sacrifice had begun. Blackwell's satisfaction slithered across the battlefield. "Break them!" he snarled, drunk on the spectacle of suffering. His dragoons pushed higher, blades raised to carve, obedience into living flesh. The Crown always demanded kneeling, always demanded someone to blame for its hunger. Then betrayal moved like a rattlesnake in the grass. Silas Pennington slipped from view. cowardice disguised beneath his fine coat. His boots carried him not toward the fight, but toward Eleanor's barn. Inside, beneath sacks of grain and hope, lay the Patriot's powder keg, enough fire to finish resistance forever. The merchant's torch kissed the straw. Flames licked upward with greedy tongues. Pennington smiled. Victory bought with the ruin of neighbors he once toasted beside a common hearth. But not all loyalists were dead inside. Jonas Briggs, barely a man yet already burdened with choices that would follow him into eternity, saw the spark. He saw the explosion coming, the massacre, the shame, the disgrace that would stain his soul. In his chest, something long buried twisted awake. Honor was a fragile thing, but once stirred, it demanded breath. He sprinted, mud sucking at his shoes, fear clawing his ribs. Blackwell shouted, mistaking his rush for bravery. He did not know the truth. Jonas hurled himself into the barn doorway. He tore the torch away, flung it aside, but fire had already found the fuse. A thread of light raced toward the powder. Jonas didn't hesitate. He threw his own coat, then his own body, upon the burning line. His flesh sizzled against the ember, the smell of sacrifice rising into the storm. He pressed down with everything he was. The fuse died beneath him, but life died with it. Eleanor reached him as rain began to smother the smoke. Jonas's eyes fluttered, searching for something beyond pain. "Tell them," he breathed, lips stained with soot. "I wasn't born a coward." His chest rose once more, then stilled, a final decision severing him from tyranny's grip. The loyalist who mocked patriots now lay as proof that dignity can bloom even in poisoned hearts. Pennington screamed in disbelief. His triumph dissolved into panic. He was revealed, not as a man of the crown, but as a petty traitor trembling in the open, and Blackwell's rage finally tangled with doubt. Even the Empire could not command a boy to trade courage for shame. Alden Crow's voice boomed from the ridge, thunder in human form. "They bleed like us. They break like us. Push them back." The Patriots rose, not as rustics or beggars, but as defenders of a sacred cause. Rebellion roared through choking rain. A traitor's courage had turned the wheel of fate, and it would not stop here. Rain hammered the ridge as smoke drifted low, hugging the ground like a wounded spectre. Alden Crow signaled without a word, and the Patriots swept down the limestone rock with a precision born from desperation. 3 crisp volleys cracked through the mist. Redcoats fell, pride spilling into mud. Then steel met flesh, knives whispering truths no empire wished to hear. Caleb Finch tore the plume from Blackwell's hat, ripping away the symbol of false dominance. Ruth Carter, grieving and unyielding, swung a carpenter's mallet with a fury sharpened by hunger and loss. A dragoon's wrist cracked like brittle kindling beneath the weight of motherhood turned rebellion. Nathan Pike and 2 militiamen rushed the cannon. Muscles strained, boots skidded. With a final heave, the iron beast toppled and rolled, smashing roots and stone, until the river's teeth swallowed its threat. British terror dissolved into chaos. The once proud line wavered as patriots reclaimed the ground, with every heartbeat. Then Eleanor stepped forward. Blackwell saw her and grinned, that same perverse laugh shredding the air. He raised his pistol, pleased to finally crush the defiance of an old rebel. But contempt slowed him. Wounds from humiliation can blind the arrogant. Eleanor didn't blink. Her fowling piece thundered, flames spitting righteous anger. The blast tore through his sword hand. Steel clattered across shale, robbed of authority. Blackwell stared at his ruined fingers in disbelief, shock unraveling his cruelty. Eleanor leveled her voice, steady as the ridge beneath her feet. "On my soil," she declared, "justice answers degradation." The captain stumbled, pride bleeding faster than his flesh. His laughter died. His command crumbled. The 16th Light Dragoons, once the terror of backcountry roads, broke like cheap glass, scrambling for the safety of the valley. Loyalists who had boasted over ale now scattered into brush, fleeing the very people they once mocked as powerless. Shame is a heavy burden, and it chased them down the slope with every gust of rain. But victory brought no cheer, only breathing, only the dull ache of survival. The ridge was littered with broken weapons, spent powder, and lives hanging by threads. Abel Garner groaned where he fell, blood pooling into the earth he had tilled. Thomas Reed still drifted between fever and the grave, his journey not yet decided. Martha's hands trembled as she prayed for his return to the living. Alden looked over the battered patriots. Neighbors turned warriors, rebels turned protectors. They had defended their dignity, but the cost waited quietly at their feet. Because independence demands more than a single triumph. Lightning flared across the clouds, brief and blinding. It illuminated the truth. Liberty breathes only if the living carry its flame forward. If they forget, even for a heartbeat, the chains return. Eleanor tightened her grip on the deed still tucked in her pocket. This land had answered tyranny today, but justice was not finished. The storm had only shifted. The living must remember. Comment: I stand with the Patriots. Evening draped the ridge in bruised purple. The storm's fury traded for a hush that felt almost sacred. Smoke curled from broken muskets and scorched earth. Thomas Reed stirred at last, the fever's grip loosening. His eyes blinked open, young, weary, but alive. When he tried to rise, Martha Lyle wrapped trembling arms around him and sobbed into his shoulder. A boy who should be worrying about chores and harvest now carried the weight of sacrifice in his bones. Liberty asked too much of the young, yet they answered without hesitation. Reverend Booker gathered the survivors beneath the battered rafters of Eleanor's cabin. His voice, though cracked from shouting prayer and orders throughout the fight, rose steady to honor those who would never again see dawn. Abel Garner, the blacksmith's great hammer, lay silent beside the hearth. Jonas Briggs, a loyalist no longer, his final breath proving dignity can be reclaimed in a single heartbeat. Each name struck like a mallet to the chest. There was mourning, but not regret. The Patriots stood together in mud-soaked boots. Some bled, some wept, all remained. With methodical resolve, Eleanor Pike climbed a stool and hammered a nail into the highest timber of her ceiling. Upon it she hung a homespun flag she had stitched from scraps. 13 rough strips, uneven yet proud, cloth born of hands that refused disgrace, hands that believed the colonies worthy of independence, even if the world had not yet agreed. A hush swept through the room as the flag settled, swaying slightly in the cooling breeze. It carried no polished embroidery, no gilded edges, only truth. Alden Crow stepped forward, placing a scarred palm over his heart. "We'll take their names to Camden," he vowed, "to King's Mountain, to every field where liberty demands its due." His voice rang with an oath forged from rebellion, a promise to march beyond this day's small victory. Because tyranny did not end here. It merely retreated to gather more steel. Thomas Reed touched the rough fabric above him. Reverent, "They'll never make us kneel," he whispered, fire rekindled behind tired eyes. His journey, nearly cut short, had barely begun. Eleanor leaned against the mantel, fingers brushing the deed in her pocket. Proof of rightful ownership. Proof of a life built on soil earned by sweat, not bestowed by a king who sneered at the commoner's worth. She looked to the flag, then to the empty wooden peg where her husband's hat once hung. His spirit lingered, not as sorrow but as resolve. The transformation was complete. Widow, farmer, defender. She stepped outside into the quiet evening, the battlefield glistening beneath the dying storm. British arrogance had left tracks in the mud, but so had courage, so had unity. The hidden truth of the backcountry had revealed itself. These people would not bow. Not to empire. Not to fear. "Let them come," Eleanor said, voice steady as iron. "We will answer." Somewhere beyond the ridge, wolves howled at the retreating hooves. The wind carried the scent of powder and wild victory. The rebellion, once whispered in barns and broken taverns, now roared from a single stormed cabin. The road ahead would demand more blood, more decisions, more sacrifice. But tonight, independence had a name, a flag, and a home. From this ridge, the journey to freedom found its direction. Night returned, softer than before, as if even the heavens wished to honor what had unfolded on this ridge. Widow's pride stood quiet, but not defeated. Lantern light flickered against the rough homespun flag above Eleanor's hearth, casting 13 shadows like sentinels sworn to guard a dream not yet fully born. The air remained thick with the scent of gunpowder and rain, and the promise of independence. Every patriot who survived carried a new weight inside them. The memory of Abel, Garner's final breath, the sacrifice of Jonas Briggs, once mocked, now remembered for valor. These were no longer simple farmers or hunted rebels. They were a people transformed by defiance, a nation still unformed, but already alive. Eleanor Pike stepped outside once more, looking over the dark fields her husband once ploughed with hope. She imagined future voices, children not yet born, running free where soldiers had tried to plant fear. No king would ever understand that liberty feeds the soil. More powerfully than any plough, it cannot be purchased, it cannot be chained, it is earned, often with blood. Her fingers brushed the deed in her pocket, a symbol of dignity defended. She stood taller, rain tracing her face like baptism. Behind her, Alden knelt beside a fainting Thomas Reed, whispering a soldier's prayer, that the young would inherit a world without kneeling. Nathan planted his musket into the mud like a standard. Martha knotted one last bandage and looked upward with silent gratitude. The night listened. Across the ridge, the British were only silhouettes fading into shame, their arrogance shattered by those they called vermin. Their contempt returned upon them like judgment. They would report the day's events as a minor skirmish. But in truth, something vast had shifted. A rebellion had found its road. In that moment, Eleanor spoke for all who stood beneath that patched flag. "We are not subjects," she whispered. "We are patriots." The words carried into the darkness, weaving themselves into the future, into battles yet to come at Camden, Kings Mountain, Yorktown, into every heart that refuses degradation, into every soul that demands to walk upright beneath the sun of independence. Let this story remind us, liberty survives only when ordinary people refuse to surrender their dignity, when the oppressed rise, when sacrifice becomes a torch, when a single cabin becomes a fortress for a nation yet unnamed. If this flame moved something inside you, stand with these patriots by letting your voice be heard. A like, a subscription, these are your way of marching beside them. And if their courage lives in you, say it proudly in the comments. The flame of freedom burns in me. Their journey is not over, nor is ours. Here is another tale of courage and sacrifice. Click and continue with me.